Sydney Banks spoke about, and some great mystics in the past have spoken about, the world as being illusionary.
Yeah.
Could you talk a bit about that, which may clarify for people?
Well, see, once you look at thought with a capital T in the human experience, just in your own life, you begin to see that it changes. Your thoughts about your car are different. It looks a little bit like a clunker. Sometimes in a day later, it looks like a classic. Your thoughts about your job give you a different feeling. Your thoughts about life, sometimes you feel really optimistic, and other times you feel a little pessimistic about it. So if you look at yourself as a thinker and look at what happens in your thinking, you'll notice that it changes during the day. And you'll notice that it's different from other people's. Now, you can't help but do that without using the word subjective. And you begin to think, wait a second, thought is subjective. Perception is subjective. The feelings we have are subjective. They're not objective. It's not like everybody looks at things the same. It's subjective. Each person has kind of a subjective version of reality in their head. So you start with subjective. Well, as you look even closer and you see that you're changing, your thought, your reality changes, say 5 years from now, things will look different. Okay? 10 years from now, your perception of the same thing will be different. You begin to feel a little more humble about your thinking. And you can't help but ask yourself, is what I'm seeing right now going to look different in a year? You know, and all of a sudden, you're a little more humble about your so-called reality, and you start using the word like arbitrary, which is even more subjective than subjective. You're saying, gee, it's arbitrary. Everybody looks like they're making it up. You know, because even they would say, it doesn't look like it looked 5 years ago. So you see people as making up their perception of life in real time. And it's not a big jump from subjective, arbitrary making it up to illusory. Because the very definition of an illusion is something that's not as it appears. Not necessarily as it appears. So an illusion is something that looks different than it really is. And that's what life looks like when you understand thought. You realize that, you know, life may not be the way I perceive it right now because it seems like my perceptions are a moving target. Another term that I use is we live in mirages. You know how when you go to the desert and you look down and you see water, and people say, well, that's not water, that's just an illusion. You say, well, it sure looks like water. Well, from that spot, you could put 1,000 people on that spot, and all of them would see water. So from whatever my level of consciousness is, and whatever my understanding of life is, life will look that way to me. But it's really a mirage because it's not really that way, because if I go to a higher level of understanding, it won't look that way anymore. So it's an appearance that isn't ultimately real. It's just a temporarily real. And that's what life is to everybody on earth, is living in an illusion of your own thinking.
So when people talk about the illusory nature of life, really it's not life so much, but it's people's perception of what they think life is and how it looks to them moment to moment. So your thinking's always going to be subjective on reality. So in that case, there's no objective reality. There's just your perception of it.
Well, the idea of an objective reality is a very is a very confounding idea. It's a very confounding question because we can only perceive life through our own thinking. Nothing can come into our experience that doesn't come from our own thinking. And using the example of a hypochondriac, whatever comes into our thinking is life to us, even though all the doctors would say it doesn't exist. So everything has to come from our thinking. So in a way of experiencing is thinking is, thought is the middleman between us and life. So thought kind of informs us what life is. Our thinking informs us as to what life is. The same way as if I'm listening to a ball game on the radio and I'm following it, in actual fact, the announcer could play a joke on me and tell me that someone just hit a home run and someone else hit a home run. They could say anything they wanted because my view of the ball game comes 100% from what that radio announcer said. I have no capacity whatsoever to know what's happening at that ballpark. You see? Now, radio announcers, sports radio announcers, are a lot more reliable than our thinking is. You see? So a lot of what we think would not stand up under scrutiny, but that's the only way that we know life. We cannot get beyond thinking to find out what's really there, what's really happening at the ballpark. And that's why when we talk about the illusory nature of life, I'm not talking about what's happening at the ballpark, but because I have no way of knowing what's happening at the ballpark, I can't. It's out of my world. There's no point in even thinking about it. Now, here's one of the interesting things. People say, well, George, if you have, say, 25 people and they agree that the thing is a certain way, doesn't that make it a reality? Well, it would be like talking to 25 people who are listening to the ball games. None of them know what really happened at the ballpark. So the fact, there was a time when everybody was convinced that the world was flat. That was in people's thinking, and there couldn't possibly be more agreement on it. And then at a later point, they found out that that's not really true. And there's been very few things in life that haven't been perceived differently over time. Now, if you go to a physicist and you say to the physicist, all right, look, we'd like to know what's going on out there, like what is the reality? The physicists are the self-proclaimed experts in reality. And when Newtonian physics was the prevailing view, there was a reality. They were measuring and they were looking at cause-effect relationships. And then quantum physics came along and poked holes in those cause-effect relationships. And they said, we'll tell you where reality is. And they discovered through what they call the Heisenberg principle that reality is changed by observation. You see? Well, that means it's not the way it appears. So physics is saying the same thing. The reality that you see is not as it appears. And in actual fact, the way it appears will be 100% what you think. So this chair that I'm sitting on, which seems completely solid, is made up of subatomic particles moving at rapid speeds, huge distances apart. But my perception of it is it's solid because that's the only way I can. That's what my thoughts present to me. So that would be the relationship between the so-called objective reality and the subjective reality.